This lecture will cover researching and establishing road and street right-of-ways. And before we go further, let me just say can be an exhaustive topic. You could literally have a 2-semester-hour course on nothing but the intricacies of city and county and private roads. You probably make it a full 3-semester-hour course, as a matter of fact. But we're going to try to hit the highlights to expose you to the various elements that are present with county, city, and private roads. And we'll start by saying, we've already covered state highways and reviewed GDOT's GOPI platform. So we're talking about roads and streets which are maintained by city and county governments or not, and how these can be an Achilles heel to the surveyor. This is because many of the reasons which must be understood, at least minimally, in the course of surveying, they're not often properly looked at. So besides a state and federal highway and a railroad, a traveled way, a path, a road, can fall into many categories. So one resource, though not conclusive, is the official DOT county map for each county. So here on the left, we have a Bing map of an area of Fannin County. And I just want you to look at all the different roads and the road names, and every white line is a road with a road sign. Now over here we have the official GDOT county map. Why is this important? Let me jump in first with one disclaimer though and say that the courts have held that this is not conclusive, and it makes sense, as to what is county maintained. In other words, you could have a county maintained road that's not on this map, and you could also have a road on this map represented as a county maintained road that the county no longer maintains. They may have abandoned it, either formally or informally, and that's some of the other subject matter that we could spend hours on. But let's just look here to make a comparison. Here in the county map, let's just look at this intersection right here north of Macedonia Church. This is Pleasant Gap Road, Chestnut Gap Road. And then this is Bearden Road that comes off to the south. So over here in the Bing map, that's this intersection. So this is Bearden Road taking off. And then this other gravel road, Red Bush Road, is over this way. As far as county maintained roads, you see Piney Cross Road. They call it Piney Acres Road. But you can see this stream right here. This shown as this stream on the GDOT map. So this is Piney Acres Road. Now here's what I want to point out. Notice Piney Trail Road is right here. People live on Piney Trail Road. Piney Trail Road's right over here. It's not indicated as being county maintained. So again, this is just a place to look. It's kind of like Q Public. This is not conclusive, not to be deemed accurate, but it's a good place to start. You come over just here to the end of Bearden Road. Notice on the Bing map we have Director Drive and some other roads that connect in there. None of those are showing up. That's a clue that those are not county maintained roads. Down here off of Bearden Road, you've got Chestnut Hills Lane. This is a private subdivision, or a subdivision with private roads. Notice that none of those roads show up on the GDOT county map. They're just not there because they're not county map. They're not county roads, so they're not shown on the map. So this is probably the best place to look, at least as a starting point. So what kind of county roads are there? Well, some are prescriptive county roads. This means that there are no express grants. There is no recorded right-of-way deed. These roads have probably been around forever. This is very common in rural areas, and anymore it's very rare in suburban and urban areas. So some of these roads probably evolved from Indian trails that turned into horse trails from settlers, and then turned into buggy lanes, and eventually were widened or adapted for vehicle traffic. As one might expect, there's commonly no recorded right-of-way deed for these roads. They just kind of evolved. Their status is prescriptive because the rights associated with them are prescriptive as opposed to express. So you may refer back to some of our property law content where, prescriptive is like adverse possession. It ripens into an unwritten right over a period of time. Now, the laws in the state of Georgia have historically covered these and made it protected these type prescriptive roads. Now, there was an interesting change in the status in 1973 when there was a Transportation Act that greatly changed a lot of the laws governing city streets and county roads. Prior to that time, a county road was said to have a minimum statutory width of 30 feet. So if a county road does not have a recorded right-of-way that you can find, and it's on a DOT county map during or prior to 1973, then that's an assurance that it existed prior to 73. So at the time of the law passing, it had a 30-foot right-of-way. Well, there was no reversion provision in the law, which means, okay, after the law, the 30-foot minimum was done away with, and it was then meant to be the extent of the maintenance of the road. That is the prescriptive use, the road banks, the ditches. And we commonly call that bank to bank and ditch to ditch. So the county's not going to get out there in many instances or areas that reflect or try to use the bank to bank and ditch to ditch. They're going to mow the banks, they're going to maintain the ditch. That's all that they claim. If you're outside of that, the county claims no interest in it. So in some areas that may be narrower than 30 feet, in some areas that may be wider than 30 feet. But if it was around in 1930, you'd pretty well have a minimum of 30 feet. And if the extent of the maintenance, the banks and the ditches are more than 30 feet, then that's probably where the prescriptive limits need to be. Now, in a purist approach, you could survey the boundary of a prescriptive right-of-way by literally surveying the limits of the banks and the back of the ditch and saying this is the prescriptive limits, and it might be this irregular shape that it is not a uniform distance from the center line. It would change according to the topography. So these do get kind of tricky. There's also the very interesting aspect that in most of the state, these prescriptive county roads are recognized as being a fee simple right-of-way, as in the county owns the property, the adjacent lands do not. This is not so in our neighboring states to the north and the east. Tennessee and the Carolinas, commonly they recognize ownership to the center of roads with an easement for the benefit of the public. And in eastern Georgia and some areas of South Georgia, we see this a lot, where property is titled to the center line of the road, and it's they'll show a right-of-way, because in North Georgia, in my career, right-of-way was always synonymous with fee simple property, but it's really just a right of way. So it's a right to travel. So it's an easement, if you want to look at it that way. So in some areas, you'll see property platted to the center line of a county road, and they'll usually show an easement or a right-of-way offset from the center line. In north and central Georgia, it's more common to see county right-of-ways like this platted as a fee simple strip. So then we have deeded right-of-ways. Now, let's think back to these old historic prescriptive roads and realize that a lot of them have been widened, been taken over, been realigned. Maybe they're too crooked, maybe they brought in equipment, straighten them out. And usually when those things happen, the county governments will get a right-of-way deed, and that clears it up. So other county roads were built brand new through raw land to connect 2 points, or to connect two roads, or to create a secondary access to an industrial park. So in these situations, the county has almost always been granted a right-of-way deed, usually in fee simple, and that's usually a funding requirement. Usually County governments do very little that is strictly with their own money. It's usually shared money with state or federal funds, and in order to get those state or federal funds, they have to play by the state or federal rules. And that usually requires owning all of the property in fee, except for slope easements and drainage easements and driveway construction easements and that sort of thing. So it can be hard to discern often just on the surface whether the county road is an overscriptive road or if it has a deeded right of way. There is no particular color in the GIS map. There is no particular line type that's on the legend in the GDOT map. So we fall back to deed research and other clues. So researching the deed records through the grantor and grantee books, as has been covered, is one way to do this. It is most of the time the best way to do this. It can also be a hard way, and it can often be inconclusive. This is because a lot of times rural right-of-way deeds were a form that says, I hereby grant 60-foot right-of-way for Podunk Road, 30 feet from the center line, and they'll have 50 signatures on there. They went up and down the road, had everybody sign it. And a lot of times it was not only efficient and practical, but it was, they could say, look, see, Mary Jones signed, so, here, you signed too. And so it was sort of a neighborhood effort, or everybody pitching together to sign over their right of way to get the county to work the road or to widen the road or to pave the road. So the problem is often those were just signatures written in cursive that were hard to read. And if they're hard to read, they're hard to index. If they're hard to index, they're impossible to find, because if Mary Jones signed that and the recording clerk and filing the index couldn't make out the name and thought that it said Harry Phones, then you'll never find that right-of-way deed looking for Mary Jones or Mary Sloan. I've saw all of these. So deed research is the best place to go, and that's where a lot of sources will tell you to go. But realize that they can be inconclusive. It's also helpful, though, if you know that they did that somewhere between 1975 and 1980. Maybe you have a clue. Maybe in looking at all of the surveys in the area, you see it as a crooked gravel road in 1974, and then the next survey that you see in 1984, it's a nice straight paved road. Looking at plats, up the road and down the road from your property. Well, that's a clue. You need to find out who owned your property between 1974 and 1982. Probably go back a few years in case they got the right-of-way deed a few years before they did the work, which is very common, and research like the whole decade for your owner. So you'll have to have to run the chain of title back to find out who owned your subject property in that time frame, and then search for them as a grantor. It's not that hard. A lot of times you can do it online. More and more, there are more of those resources. If not, you just have to go to the clerk's office. If it's just evolved over time, you don't know when they paved it, you don't really see a date or an era where it probably changed, then you're left with less clues. So what can other things do? So if you get a title report, title commitment, a lot of times, boom, subject to a right-of-way deed to Podunk County in 1987. Wow, there it is. You don't even have to go looking. That's why a title commitment and a title report is so valuable, even for rural properties, for non-ALTA surveys. Ask for them, take the benefit of their research. It produces a better product. It can save you a lot of time, make your work product better and more profitable. I will repeat that through the course. Try to get copies of your title commitments when they are available. One problem with that, a lot of these roads were built in the 60s, 70s, 50s. What's the problem with that? Standard title search nowadays only goes back 50 years. So take, for example, if you're surveying a piece of property in 2024, the right-of-way deed was signed in 1973, will not pick up on most title reports. Some title examiners will go back farther. Sometimes they go back to where, say, the seller has owned the property since 1965, they may go all the way back to 1965, which is good title practice, but it's not really required under their title standards so much because it's beyond the 50-year search period. One often overlooked resource, but not to be relied on exclusively, is a phone call or an email to the road department or the public works department or the engineering department if the county has one. Often they can say, yeah, let me get back to you. Very often I get an email with a right-of-way deed. Beautiful. Handed to me by the authoritative source, the road department that owns the road and maintains it. That's not always available, and you can get bad information. Sometimes you have to make your best judgment, and we'll come back to that. But another source are to look at these adjacent surveys up and down the road. You know, if it was a narrow gravel road in 1975 on a survey, 2 parcels up the road showing a 30-foot right-of-way, they're probably telling you, hey, this is just a 30-foot prescriptive road, and we're honoring the old 30-foot minimum statutory width. Very common practice. Or then you find a survey down the road, a parcel or two, that shows 60-foot right-of-way, nice straightened out paved road. Well, if you're looking at that nice straightened out paved road, you know that's a clue to help you go find that. So always look at all of your research. Another word of caution when you deal with communications with the road department, the public works department, don't let that be conclusive. So here's an example. Here's a survey from 1986 where a surveyor was hired to divide out an acre. Well, it came out to .99, but anyway, you know, this is how the landowner wanted this acre divided out at the intersection of these 2 roads. Now, I will tell you that this is not labeled very well, but it is a dirt county road. And notice he says center line of ditch. So he's recognizing the ditch as the extent of the prescription. Problem is this road was here back in the Great Depression, so the 30-foot minimum width actually prevails. So he was trying to do good, but he didn't really properly apply the whole correct legal doctrine. Over here we see Flat Branch Road, County Road number 26, road paved, 50-foot right-of-way. Great. I'm going to stop right here and say, I happen to know this situation. I'm familiar with it. 2 things I want to point out, or a few things. One, this is what the surveyor, who I have cut off the bottom part of his seal. He's a good person. I don't want to embarrass him. But my understanding is a phone call was made to the county road department. Whoever answered the phone said, yeah, 50 foot. That's what he went with. Road paved, 50-foot right-of-way. That did not really adequately satisfy what needed to be done. We're going to look at that a little bit more. Another thing to point out is, I found out, because this is a matter that I've had personal involvement with, when this 1986 survey was made for, let's just say, John Doe. Let's say that Joe Gibson sold this to John Doe. John Doe got a loan at the bank, built a house, or for this house, there was a house on the property. The idea was to cut out an acre and the house. So the bank had a loan, the bank got a title commitment, title insurance policy. That title commitment says subject to right-of-way deed book, or in plat book. I can't remember, it's on the next slide, but it's in the title commitment. It says that this property right here is subject to this right-of-way deed right here on the right-hand side of your fence, where Joe Gibson conveyed in April of 1952 a 100-foot right-of-way. Boom. Recorded deed, easily found under the grantor's name for a 100-foot right-of-way, yet the surveyor chose to pick up the phone, call the road department. What's the right-of-way on Flat Branch Road? 50 feet? Great, thanks. Poof, off they went. So this is what not to do. And again, So I'm going back to the title commitment. It was 1986. They didn't have fax machines. They didn't have email. But he could have called, somebody hired him. Somebody called him to do this survey. Joe Gibson decided to sell this acre and a house to John Doe. They knew there was a mortgage involved. They knew there was a bank involved. They knew there was an attorney involved. Surveyor could have picked up the phone and said, "Hey, when you did your title search, did you find any right-of-way deeds up there?" "You did? Joe Gibson signed a right-of-way deed in 1952? What book and page? I'm going to go down to the courthouse and pick it up." "Oh, you'll make a copy of it for me to pick up at your office? That's wonderful. We'll swing by and get it. Thanks for saving us the time." Poof, this never would have happened. So here's 0.99 acres per the 1986 survey. This is a survey by yours truly, where we find that Kells Ridge Drive is a 30-foot right-of-way, as has been confirmed by other surveys in the area. And here is Flat Branch Road, the 100-foot right-of-way per Deed Book 40, page 13, which is the right-of-way deed that was on the previous slide. That 0.99 now turns out to only be 0.86. Somebody wants to know, where is their 1/1300ths of an acre? I have saw similar instances that I could not provide as clear example of, where very similar situation happened. They platted the right of way too close to the road, and structures were built where they thought were on private property, but were actually straddling and partly within the right of way of the county road. And now you've got a private structure illegally built on public property. That's big damages. That's somewhere you don't want to go as a surveyor, because you're going to be paying the bill to move the house, buy right away. It just gets nowhere pretty. Now, let's talk about the next way that a lot of right-of-ways come to be is implied dedication. And there are basically two flavors that I deal with that we'll talk about under implied dedication. The most common way is when streets or roads are depicted on a subdivision plat where a common grantor is doing a simultaneous conveyance style subdivision. So these road right-of-ways are created. There is your source for the boundary. Now, if you need to know who owns them, that gets a little bit more complicated. Because a recorded subdivision plat on its own does not establish whose road it is, but the boundaries of the right-of-way are usually reliably depicted on there, because that's where those boundaries are created, where that road was created. Second way is on a recorded plat of a piece of property. Let's take the example we just looked at, and let's say that the first surveyor accidentally got his roads mixed up and said this is a 100-foot right-of-way. And then later research revealed, no, it's not 50. Well, what happens to that 1/1300ths of an acre in that situation, or that 25-foot wide strip that's in question? Well, the new owner of the 0.86 acre, they don't have any claim to that 25-foot strip. It's not in their deed. Did the previous owner retain it? Can he landlock them? Did he keep a 25-foot strip? Well, in theory, he did. Joe Gibson might still own that 25-foot strip if he only deeded a 50-foot right-of-way. But the courts have upheld that when a recorded plat shows a width, shows a right-of-way on a plat, it doesn't have to be a subdivision plat and part of a simultaneous conveyance, just a single one-off division survey or a retracement survey like we just looked at, then that alone can stand as dedication for the road. In other words, Joe Gibson can't come back and say, oops, I've got 25 feet. I want to sell you that I didn't sell you. I kept it by accident. I'll give it to you for X amount of money. Basically, the courts will say that Joe Gibson has given that up. And part of the legal doctrine there is he's represented that bigger line as being the property line when he conveyed it and sold it. So he's kind of put his own desires on public record. Now, a lot of times what we're doing there is we're putting words in people's mouth, because Joe Gibson may not have had any idea about any of that, but through his actions, through the surveyor, those statements are made and put on the public record. So, the Courts have upheld that the depiction of a right-of-way like that will depict it. There are examples that can be found easily in Pindar's writings, but this may be uncommon on an otherwise prescriptive road. And it is unique that there's often no legal basis for the right-of-way shown, yet it all of a sudden becomes legally binding on the property, like we just we're talking about. So this can also create an odd situation where if you look at 3 properties in a row, and let's say that you're surveying Tract B, Tract A shows a 50-foot right-of-way, Tract B shows a 40-foot right-of-way, Tract C shows a 60-foot right-of-way. Are all 3 correct? Are any of them correct? Are any of them wrong? Well, if it's just an old prescriptive road, they're probably all right because each one of those separate plats has created a right-of-way boundary unique to that parcel through the doctrine of implied dedication. Now, that would not be, that would still be subjective to any extent of the rights, extent of the use, prescriptive rights that may be beyond the width shown. But if they show a width, then that's, and there's no recorded right-of-way deed or anything to the contrary, then that's going to establish it for each of those parcels, and it may indeed go 50, 40, 60. City streets, these first 3 categories all apply equally to city streets, but there are some subtle differences. In the old code, there were some other statutory widths for alleys and streets. In some cases, I believe the minimum width for an alley was 16 feet. The minimum width for a street might have been 24, 25 feet. I don't get into all those details. Most of these city streets, though, were created through implied dedication. It's widely held that when the old city maps were prepared and recorded that show alleys and streets, even if they were not built at that time, it's recognized that the process of recording those old plats dedicated the right-of-ways to the city. For example, most of the streets in the city of Atlanta are shown on old hand-drawn, beautiful works of art that platted it into rectangular lots and blocks, square city blocks with 50 by 100 or 40 by 60 or 45 by 90. You know, they varied whatever size lots, often with an alley. And this is before any of these laws really became applicable. So if they show a 32 or a 33 foot wide street right-of-way, that controls. If they show a 14-foot alley, which I have seen, or a 12-foot alley, that would control. And so that's how a lot of these came up. And I've surveyed property where the boundaries were created in the late 1800s, not long after the Civil War, and that's what created a lot of these city blocks. The lots on them. It's pretty neat to research back on a lot of those. A lot of those, if you want to just like get on the Fulton County Q Public page and go to downtown Atlanta, a lot of it was done probably, some of it was done right post World War, some of it was done leading up to the Great Depression, but a lot of them go back into the 1880s and 1890s. Private ways. We could teach for weeks on private ways. Prescriptive roads, trespasses, the legal way under the statute to establish a private way, the legal ways to extinguish a private way. I'm going to give a broad overview because to the extent basically what I would call minimum technical competency for a surveyor regarding private ways. So roads that are in use by a select group of people, usually property owners at the end of a road, but can include hunters, delivery drivers, even school buses, which can really muddy the waters because that's a government agency. But all of these uses can create private prescriptive easements by their use. Often these roads have been assigned names by the local government for emergency services purposes, like 911 addressing, but having a name changes nothing from the legal perspective. Just like that first map we looked at, all those roads that have names but are not county maintained, the fact that they have names doesn't change them. They all have names and look the same on the Bing map or the Google map, but that changes nothing about their legal status. Many people believe that once they put a road sign up, that now it's a public road, now it's a county road. Now they can call the road department and say, hey, there's a pothole, come fix it. It's not necessarily true. Private ways can also be expressly created. In other words, created through an easement document through all the proper parties. Now, that's obviously best, but that's not always true. Many subdivision roads, which were created under the implied dedication doctrine as a simultaneous conveyance, they're still privately maintained. Now, this can be for a couple of reasons. This can either be by default or by design. So in the modern era, unlike when the city of Atlanta was being developed 100 years ago, implied dedication to government has become more scrutinized. True dedication of property to a government requires two parts, a dedication and an acceptance. Often the acceptance is conditional, requiring a period of time where the developer has to maintain the road. Basically, I'd say the average is 2 years. Developer maintains the road for 2 years, shows that it's not going to fall in, there's no potholes, the bank's not going to fall off. The county's acceptance is usually conditioned on, that 2-year period. And a lot of times they'll put down a course coat of paving for all of the construction traffic while the houses are being built. And then part of the acceptance is that the developer has to come in a top coat or a prime coat of paving, make it nice and smooth and freshly paved so that all the people in the neighborhood have this nice, freshly paved road where they've been having all this construction to beating the road up. And then the county has much less maintenance responsibility too because they have this nice, freshly top coat paved road. There's also bonds that put finances in place if road repairs are needed. All these things are required for the acceptance, and if they're not fully satisfied, then the county's not taking them, and you wind up with a mess where the roads remain privately owned and privately maintained, and they may have been designed for the county to take the roads over. And so there may not be road maintenance provisions. POA dues may not cover road maintenance. It can get really messy, but this is just some of the things that come along with private ways. Now, another thing, along with prescriptive county roads, where they've just come into use and the county maintains them, the fact that county forces and county funds and the taxpayers have been maintaining those roads make them county roads. If you try to close one off, the county attorney and the sheriff will come out there and make you take the barricade down and probably arrest you. On these prescriptive private ways, if you try to block one, the county doesn't have any obligation to defend that. The sheriff's department's going to come out there and they're going to tell you to go hire a lawyer because this is a civil matter. Now there's this other category right here, number 6, public roads, that falls into falls into none of the other 5 buckets. It's similar to almost all of them except for expressly deeded right-of-ways. So realize that through the evolution of these old roads, when they were started off as Indian trails, turned into horse trails, turned into buggy wagon trails, turned into old T-model car trails, and now they've become roads. They've not always been maintained by the government. Think back to a simpler time of smaller government and lower taxes. Doesn't that sound nice? But there aren't road departments, or at least they only maintain the major roads, the major thoroughfares. All of these little side roads, they just didn't have the resources or the money to maintain them. So the people that use them maintain them. The people who own the property next to them maintain them. Now, I don't mean that they had big Caterpillar road maintenance equipment. What they probably did was they might have, if the road was washed out, they probably hitched up the mule, turned their plow a different way than when they're plowing roads. They went up there and plowed a ditch or regraded the road. And this still goes on with farm tractors. I don't know anybody that still uses mules or horses, but I do know of private roads and even some public roads or county roads where people will get out there and help to keep them up just because they use the road. It's for the public good. People are generally good. This could also mean just cutting a tree out of the road that a storm blew over. So this would all been basically private maintenance, but for the public good, but no public funds, no public personnel were used. So these old public roads remain open, but they fall into a sad state of repair. They're usually just dirt. Sometimes they'll have some gravel. That's rare, because where'd the gravel come from? Who's going to spend money on these old public roads? And to be clear, I'm talking about roads that are open to and used by the public, but the county does not maintain. They're rare. They're very rare. Many of you will never see roads like this, but if you survey in the rural areas, in the southeastern U.S. especially, you will find a lot of these. So what's important here is that's definitely something that has to be reflected on plat. It's a potential easement, potential right-of-way, it's a traveled way, it's a use that's got an unwritten right associated with it. We have to depict it, and like I said, going in, you really need to know whose road is it? How do I approach this as a surveyor? Is this a private road? Is this a county road? Rarely you get into the situation of the public road. So when someone tries to block one of these roads where the public's been using it, well, the county is really barred from protecting private property and private rights. So you basically wind up in a situation, I've been involved in some of these, where elements of the public come out and basically make an analogous class action suit, to where they say, you know, my dad used this property for 50 years and he died 10 years ago. I've been using it all my life and I'm 55 years old. And they'll sign an affidavit of this source, and they'll say, I know that the public's used it and this road's never been blocked. The public's always been able to use this road. And they can do these things and file an action. They probably all have to pool their money together to hire a lawyer. And I've saw this happen. And the court will say, yes, the class of people that has prescriptive rights ripened is the public at large. Now that's really bad if you own the property, because now the public at large has a right to come on your property, just where the old road is, but you still have that liability issue. That's why a lot of people try to block them off. Sometimes they block them off thinking the people that use this road, they'll never sue me. They won't put their money together. And usually they're probably right. That usually probably works. Prescriptive rights expire at the same rate that they ripen. So if it takes 7 years of use to establish a prescriptive easement or prescriptive right-of-way so that you can't be blocked, if you are blocked, that's working the other way. The owner is blocking your access to this area. So after 7 years, he has reclaimed that land and extinguished the prescriptive right. You probably see where I'm saying we could go on and on about all of these. There are all kinds of cases that are neat to study, situations and examples. I want your takeaway to be that sometimes it's either impossible or impractical to exhaustively research every possible aspect of a road when you're trying to determine a right-of-way boundary. Surveyors are obligated and required to make a reasonable effort to satisfy the requirement of prerequisite research into these adjacent right-of-way boundaries. Sometimes, though, the surveyor is left with having to decide what he or she thinks is the correct or applicable width and simply state the reasoning for the decision. Now, in that board rule we've gone to, this is in paragraph 2, and it says that when you can't make everything conformable to the recorded title boundary, then you state in undisputable language the reasoning for your decision. And I'll close with this. Often it is advisable, if you're in that situation where there's no right-of-way deed, it's got tar and gravel on it, and it's about 45 feet wide, and you want to call it a 45-foot right-of-way, or just locate the bank or the ditches and call that the right-of-way extent. Do the best you can, explain what you based it on, and then I encourage you to close with some statement like this. This survey is subject to the discovery of any additional right-of-way information. Now, go back to our initial example. 1986, this right-of-way deed was only 34 years old. It wasn't that hard to find. That you're not relieved from finding something like that. It was easy to find. It was obvious. The character of the road is usually a clue. This was a nice engineered 20 or 22 foot wide paved road in a rural area. Those don't just happen. Roads that just happen in situations like that are usually curvy and hilly and crooked. So that was a clue that maybe this was built with state funds. That was a clue to look a little bit further. If it had been a 12-foot wide single lane gravel road and they wanted to use a 30-foot right of way, that would have been a lot more understandable. Anyway, cover yourself and explain what you've done. That way, take for example, if such a note had been on that 1986 survey, he would have looked a lot less culpable or at fault when that came up a few years later that he was off by 25 feet and it resulted in 13/100ths of an acre difference. If he'd have said, I looked everywhere, I called the road department, I examined plats in the area, I'm going with 50 feet as the most likely right-of-way width, but this survey is subject to the discovery of any additional right-of-way information, he's kind of put people on notice. Also on that, the closing attorney should have caught it. That's not all on the surveyor. The closing attorney should have saw her title report and said, there's a 100-foot right-of-way deed on this road. Hey, surveyor, your plat shows 50-foot right-of-way, but I'm looking at a right-of-way deed from 1952 for 100 feet. Don't you think you want to take a look at it and maybe revise your plat and maybe move the line up to the north to take in an acre outside of this? That didn't happen. So people don't always do what they're supposed to do. We're the last one to know and the first one to be blamed. Welcome to the surveying world. I hope this has been useful to you.